Hello, everyone. Welcome to Getting Climate Ready webinar. I apologize, you probably saw several slides there. We were just having some technical difficulties here, but now we are ready to begin. And it looks like most people are signed on. And so I'm just going to go over a couple technical pointers before we get ready here. First of all, everyone that signs in is muted, and please do keep yourself muted. At question time, there's a question box that you can type in your questions. If you need to communicate with us before then, there's also a chat feature, so you can type in any sort of things that you'd like to mention or comment on in the chat box, but do please keep yourself muted. You can join either by phone, and I have the phone number displayed here, as well as the code that you'll have to punch in, or you can also use the audio on your computer. If you're having any technical difficulties, I have an email here that you can email for assistance, or you can also type in the chat feature if you need additional assistance, and my colleague Jim will help you out. I think that covers the technical aspects of the webinar. So I'd like to officially welcome you to this third webinar in the Getting Climate Ready series. I'm excited about this third one. Many of you have been on the other two or other one perhaps. This one is on planning for climate change on the coast, the sea level rise adaptation primer. It's a specific tool kit that exists. And today we're lucky to have this as a part of the webinar series, which I would just like to mention and thank that we have wonderful support from Natural Resources Canada, as well as Climate Action Secretariat for this webinar series. And it's a part of the Regional Adaptation Collaborative too. And you're happily participating in our informal community of practice with other practitioners that are interested in how to increase our capacity to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So for today, we're going to start with an overview of the Sea Level Rise Adaptation Primer. And Thomas White, who is the Manager of Science and Adaptation in the Climate Action Secretariat in the BC Ministry of Environment, will be here talking to us. We have his picture here, so you can imagine him speaking when he's showing his slides. So Thomas is responsible for coordinating the delivery of Preparing for Climate Change, British Columbia's adaptation strategy across the provincial government. And Thomas grew up in Montreal with a yearning to be closer to the mountains and the sea. After spending some time in Toronto and Jasper, Alberta, he arrived in BC 12 years ago and has never looked back. So he'll give us a great overview. And then secondly, we'll move on to more in-depth about the Sea Level Rise Adaptation Primer. And Graham Farstad with the Arlington group will give us that in-depth look. And Graham is a land use planner who worked as the city planner for Prince George and later New West for 15 years. He has been a planning consultant with the Arlington Group Planning and Architecture for the past 21 years, and his background in flood hazard management goes back nearly 19 years. And for recreation, he likes whitewater paddling and sea kayaking, both activities that can be pursued regardless of climate change and sea level rise. So I know I've had the chance to meet both of these people in person, and they're great resources on the question at hand. After we hear from Thomas and Graham, we will have questions which you can type in using your question box, and then we'll wrap up by 11. And the one other thing I would just mention is that this webinar will be available afterwards. We are recording it. And I'm not sure if there's any other questions that I see popping up. It looks like most people have been able to get online and are having success. So given that, I'm going to turn it over to Thomas. And so Thomas, I'm going to give this to you, and you should be able to have control and start speaking when you get the access from me.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Elizabeth. It gave me control, and can you see the opening slide? Elizabeth, can you see the getting ready title slide from my presentation?
Yes, you're good to go.
Good. Alrighty, well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to very quickly walk through some of the provincial context and set the background for Graham's talk. So to begin, we believe that sea level rise will continue for the foreseeable future, and the rate will likely accelerate. Some of the reports that have come out recently, in September, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released its 5th assessment report. This September, and in September 2012, they released another report on extreme events. Our view from both of those is that it is reasonable and prudent to expect more sea level rise and to expect a rate that is faster than what we have observed in the 20th century, which amounted to about 20 centimeters from 1900 to 2000. And to also expect higher sea surface heights, not just from straight sea level rise, but from storminess. So in general, we expect to sea level rise to continue, and at a rate that is faster than what we've seen even in the last 40 years. And the rate in the last 40 years has been about 3 millimeters per decade. We also believe that failure to plan appropriately will result in large and unnecessary costs. So we have an opportunity now to understand what sea level rise will mean for us in British Columbia, and to take steps with respect to land use planning and infrastructure design to do things differently. And we believe that in many instances, doing these things differently now and upfront will avoid expenses later. The best Canadian example of this is the Confederation Bridge connecting Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick. It's a 17-kilometer span, and that has been built with 1 meter of sea level rise in mind by the end of the 21st century. And it's easy to see why. The upfront costs of that extra expense pale in comparison to what one would have to do if you had to make that change later. And in fact, I think to upgrade a 17-kilometer span for 1 meter sea level rise after the fact is basically impossible. The chart on the left of this slide shows projected sea level rise for various scenarios of economic growth through to the end of the 21st century. In order to make predictions about what sea level rise is going to look like in 2100, the IPCC has to make guesses about economic development. So very briefly here, the blue scenario is a very aggressive green growth scenario where not only does the global economy wean itself off of fossil fuels, but we're actually successful at inventing a technology that removes CO2 from the atmosphere. Even in that scenario, we can expect, according to the IPCC, about a 40-centimeter rise in sea levels by the end of the century. A more likely scenario from our perspective is the one in red, which is the upper scenario for IPCC, and that's where, if you're tracking emissions, we're trending on that scenario right now. And this is a sort of a business as usual scenario, and we can see that by the end of the century, the line itself is sort of the median projection, and the band is showing the uncertainty or the range of projections around that median, and we can see that the IPCC is projecting about a meter of sea level rise at a global level, and we think that that's a number that's prudent to plan for. We also believe that every coastal community is unique, and the approaches the right approach will vary for each community, and we have vast differences in circumstances in British Columbia. We have highly developed areas along the coast like Vancouver and all the municipalities, local governments in the Metro Vancouver region. We also have smaller communities, remote communities all along the British Columbia coast, as one sees in the panel on the left. And of particular concern in those communities is the hydrological connection between the river and the sea. We've had several instances in the last 5 years of flooding that has occurred at this time of year, when we tend to have naturally elevated sea surface levels, at the same time as you get a heavy discharge coming down the river because of an intense rainfall event. And the interaction of the two causes worse flooding. So we have a lot of more remote coastal communities that are in this kind of situation, where they're at the mouth of a river, and the potential for both sea level rise and increasing heavy precipitation puts these communities at risk. Not every community is in that circumstance, but I just want to emphasize that these local circumstances matter, and what works in one place isn't necessarily going to work in every place. So with that in mind, our objectives are that communities, governments, and the private sector have the information that they need to plan for sea level rise. So we aim to ensure that decision makers have good information, not just about what to expect in terms of physical changes, how much sea levels are going to rise, but what are the options that they should consider or can consider in terms of responding. Our second objective is that provincial policy enables adaptation. So we want to make sure that our policy framework around flood policy, for instance, and land use policy on the coast, that it doesn't have any barriers in it that would prevent other decision makers from making appropriate decisions, and in fact that it actually enables and perhaps encourages taking adaptive measures. And our third objective is that the public is informed about the issues and the progress in addressing them. We've come a long way since 2007, which is really when our work on sea level rise kick-started. This was following the release in 2007 of the IPCC's fourth assessment report, which also projected a 1 meter, at an extreme level, 1 meter of sea level rise by the end of the 21st century. Following that, we did some work to develop point-based estimates of sea level rise along the British Columbia coast, because we knew that in a tectonically active region, the relative sea level rise would be different than the global level. Parts of the coast are moving up, and so for a meter of sea level rise globally, we might expect less than a meter of sea level rise locally. But in other parts, like in the Fraser River Delta, the land is subsiding, and so 1 meter of sea level rise will actually be more than 1 meter of relative sea level rise at the local area. In 2010, we developed our adaptation strategy, which has guided a lot of our adaptation work. And then between 2010 and present, we benefited from a lot of investment by NRCan in developing products to help us plan for sea level rise. And some of these included a sea level rise planning curve. So we wanted to have a resource for communities that didn't or couldn't produce a point-based estimate for their local community, to have essentially a chart that they could look up what to expect in terms of sea level rise over the next century. And this is the curve that you see in the bottom of this slide. We developed methods to estimate where the natural boundary, so this is the upper mark, the high water mark, or otherwise where the vegetation line would be along the coast, where that would be with sea level rise. And then along with those guidelines, we developed mapping guidelines, and this is, you see an example of this on the top of the slide for Campbell River. So we have tools that will enable communities to map what areas might be affected by sea level rise at different points in time. We also did a study on standards for sea dikes, of which there are many in the lower mainland. So how high should these be considering sea level rise? As soon as we produced that, we realized we also would benefit from having a cost estimate. And so in 2012, we produced a cost estimate of how much money it would take to upgrade the sea dikes to a standard of protection that we think we would need in 2100. And most recently, we've worked on a sea level rise adaptation primer. So the focus of the work between 2010 and 2012 on sea dikes was very much on a hard infrastructure engineering protection-based approach to responding to sea level rise. And we realized that we didn't, that there are other options for responding to sea level rise, including green approaches, land use-based approaches, et cetera, and that we needed a product for local governments and other decision makers in British Columbia that summarized those. And that is what Graham is going to tell us about a bit more. But we're very pleased with this product. There is a version that is up on the web right now as of earlier this year, and we're currently revising that version and developing companion tools to make sure that this information is more accessible. But we're very pleased with this product. It includes information on how to plan for sea level rise, describes various tools that Graham will tell us about more in detail, and the companion materials will help primarily for communication purposes to explain to the public what these options are. So without further ado, I think I would like to thank you for your attention and turn it back over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Thomas. That is great. We're going to now hear from Graham. I'm just going to pull up. Graham and I are in the same room, which is unusual for a webinar, but we're lucky enough to be in the same area, same room, along with some other colleagues. But I'm going to turn it over to Graham, and he will be able to tell you much more than myself.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth, and thanks very much, Thomas, for setting the context for this process. The purpose of the primer is really to provide an adaptation resource for coastal managers that focus on tools that are currently available. Interestingly, many of these tools were not originally created with sea level rise in mind, but many of them are very quite able to accommodate that for a different role. The areas we're going to cover Canadian study areas, sea level rise adaptation framework, sea level rise adaptation strategies, adaptation tools, and some other responses, and then get into a question period. The study areas really, the title refers to Canada's southern coast, and some people have said we don't have a southern coast. Well, in one sense that's correct, but we're talking about the Pacific Ocean and Atlantic Ocean, but in the southern portion of the country, because there's really unique factors dealing with the Arctic in terms of ice issues and permafrost. So that's where the reference is if you have trouble finding where our southern coasts are. The areas in question, we're talking about British Columbia, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Labrador and Newfoundland. And so we've originally focused on British Columbia, and that will be the primary focus today. But the primer really does have a lot of information regarding examples of legislation and particular approaches that are taken in the eastern part of the country. BC, we have a very large coastline, well over something in the order of 26,000 kilometers, mainly islands, everything from Washington State to Alaska, from Victoria to Stewart, BC, and it's a huge coastline. And the vast majority of our population around Vancouver Island and the southwest corner of the province is affected by sea level rise and coastal impacts. So about 80% of our population is really in that small portion of the province. The picture there is sort of an interesting illustration of a king tide in Victoria. The the main slide shows the king tide effect from last year, and the one on the lower right shows a more normal event. It's kind of an illustration of things to come. And by the way, this weekend is when the king tides will be occurring in the lower mainland area. There's 4 sea level rise adaptation strategies that we've identified, and I'll come back to that at the end because essentially the tools can be combined in different ways, and we're really looking at 4 possible strategies: protect, accommodate, retreat, and avoid. The protect is the historical approach that we've taken going back to before the 20th century. It's really the idea of protecting people, property, and infrastructure from sea level rise, and is really the first response that tends to occur. Typically, that's been the use of dikes and seawalls around the coastline. Some of the challenges that we're facing with that approach, though, is that it creates an expectation that coastal defenses will be maintained indefinitely and will be satisfactory. And that's, we can't necessarily assume that as sea level rise occurs. And there's also the moral hazard of inducing people to undertake risky behavior if they think that we are able to protect all of these areas indefinitely. We're going to have to spend more money in the future, and it may not always work. Since, for quite a number of years, British Columbia has at least supplemented the protect strategy with an accommodate strategy, because recognizing that dikes may breach and we might have problems there, the accommodate strategy is essentially looking at how we protect land on-site. So raising the elevation of a structure through fill, providing a scour protection for foundation, providing the structure to be more resilient, and the habitable space above a higher level, which in British Columbia we refer to as the flood construction level, the base elevation for habitable buildings. That's really the accommodate strategy, and the two can work together. But for functional, for organizational purposes, we've separated them. And then retreat strategy is an approach that is quite new, but in some instances we're seeing with extreme events, it may be necessary to rethink what we can protect. So retreat or managed retreat is an approach of backing up in an organized way. Finally, void strategy is really a planning exercise in which we look at areas of land and determine, based on sea level rise projections, is this an appropriate area to be developing in the future? It may be more suitable for environmental protection purposes. So essentially, that's a fourth approach. The strategies really have an overall context, and I think this slide shows how that adaptation framework works. I think the key thing we wanted to stress here is that adaptation should be viewed as an ongoing, iterative process in which risks and opportunities are prioritized, risk reduction measures are implemented, and the effectiveness of outcomes is reviewed. So there's really four boxes there. The information gathering in the upper left-hand corner refers to things like internal capacity building, study of local conditions that could modify sea level rise, GIS mapping. Many of our information resources started in British Columbia with a federal provincial program in 1975, and that continued for 25 years. We're now seeing that some of those information resources are out of date. So information gathering is something that has to be updated from time to time. And also there's this question of assessment of risk and vulnerability. The upper right-hand corner shows public education and community engagement, really critical elements, because in a democracy, you have to have the people on side. You can't do it all top-down. So there's a need for consultation and public education. I think the key things here are education combined with awareness. Adaptation tools in the bottom right-hand corner refers to determining what is the most suitable adaptation strategy, which could vary from one part of a community to another and from community to community. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have identified the adaptation tools in the way we have, because each community's circumstances are going to be different. And then finally, the question of monitoring and evaluation. There's a need to monitor the effectiveness of chosen tools, monitoring measurable indicators, and reevaluating communities' level of acceptable risk. It's a continuing process, and that's why you see the circles, the arrows in the middle. To meet time to time and reevaluate whether a particular strategy may be the most suitable, might change over time. So I think that's an important factor to note because it's dynamic. The adaptation tools, there's really 5 categories that we identified: planning tools, regulatory tools, restriction tools, which are a variation of regulatory tools, which may or may not involve government, structural tools, and non-structural tools. The planning tools, we've identified 4 separate types of planning tools: objectives and policies, coastal hazard mapping, risk management, and emergency planning and preparedness. So the first one, objectives and policies, really involves the setting of objectives and policies to manage land use and development in coastal areas at risk from the effects of sea level rise and associated coastal hazards. We have a long history in British Columbia of identifying through policies and objectives, through community plans and the like, our objectives. And these may change over time, but it sets the tone, and we have, it's something that's well recognized, and it's important to set these forward in a local context as to what our plans are for particular areas of the community and the community as a whole. Coastal hazard mapping is a second planning tool we've identified. As I say, we have a long history of using coastal hazard mapping. This is an example from Campbell River, where there's been some fairly recent work to update coastal hazard mapping. But the key here is identifying flood and erosion hazards and to provide the technical basis for land use planning and develop bylaws in floodplains and coastal areas at risk. A really critical element, and a number of municipalities are doing some very detailed coastal hazard mapping to address these current risks. The Capital Regional District is one example, just starting out in that process, and the City of Vancouver is well underway in that process as well. Risk management is really a process that's widely used to identify and manage the adverse impacts of a change in conditions. A really critical element here is it gives us some tools to identify what are the best areas to expend resources and to evaluate outcomes. A good example is that in the United States, the Federal Emergency Management Authority undertook a detailed analysis of flood hazard projects over an extended period of time, and they concluded that in the flood hazard situations, the benefit-cost ratio was 5-to-1. In other words, the expenditure of preventative work to manage risk and reduce the risk paid off dramatically in terms of an investment from society, as opposed to spending the money after the fact. And that's the sort of thing that rigor is really important to help us choose, given scarce resources, how to manage risk. We're also seeing the question of risk being reevaluated because it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And it was originally minimum standards was a 1 in 100-year event. BC chose a 1 in 200-year event. And we're now looking at people taking a more conservative approach simply because the consequences of a disaster are so great. Emergency planning and preparedness. In British Columbia, every local jurisdiction has an obligation to undertake emergency planning, develop local plans, and to really undertake those measures in advance of a disaster or to mitigate the risks of a disaster. There's also a role for the province, which can step in if a local jurisdiction is overwhelmed, but the base is to create a resilient approach at the local level. Regulatory tools really deal with 4 areas. Another way of thinking of that is really the gatekeeper function. Somebody standing at the gate to determine whether you can pass through or not, the conditions under which you can. So 4 areas are subdivision regulation, building regulation, regulation of land use, and development permits. So the question of subdivision regulation is essentially a growth management tool used to regulate the conditions for the subdivision of land, including land at risk from coastal hazards associated with sea level rise. Here, the approving officer has great authority. Virtually every local government has an approving officer, and in rural areas, Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure have people with that responsibility as well. So that's from the get-go, setting the tone, the conditions for subdivision, and they can be very specific and have been increasingly so over the years. Often conditions for subdivision can be regulated on title, so it serves as a notice for future purchases of the property after the developer has gone. Building regulation, really the ability of a building inspector or other appointed local government representative to require a geotechnical report to ensure that a building can be safely used for its intended purpose. So that's an important element because at the final stage before building, there is that ability of the building inspector, if he doesn't know the exact risk, to call for a qualified professional to undertake that assessment. Typically, they would identify what would be required to make the building safe, with the restriction in terms of setbacks, raise of elevation, foundation protection, things of that nature. And it does give particular authority to that building official. It varies from place to place. The City of Vancouver has particular role in terms of additional requirements beyond the base of the BC Building Code. So there's some important considerations there. The picture, by the way, is Confederation Building in Charlottetown, PEI. You can see right building built on sea level, how important it is to undertake building regulation. Land use regulation is the establishment of appropriate zoning for areas subject to or potential subject to coastal hazards. This is a tried and true method. We've had a lot of experience in British Columbia with land use regulation through zoning, and there are a number of particular areas such as setbacks from coastal hazards, minimum elevation rise from those coastal hazards through flood construction level minimums, and making the building more resilient or requiring building materials that are flood resistant. So we have a lot of techniques here. That's something that virtually every community has as a tool. Development permit is kind of a unique one in British Columbia. It has variations that are different in the City of Vancouver, but essentially it's taking a site-specific approach to looking at a hazard and how that hazard can be addressed. It requires a official community plan to identify the conditions under which the development should proceed and how that needs to be addressed. And it really covers 2 particular areas. One is the protection of the natural environment, and the other approach is the protection of development from hazardous conditions such as floods, debris flows, and the like. So that enables a very site-specific approach to take place. The next group is restriction tools, and there's 5 areas we have identified: land acquisition, transfer of development potential, easements and covenants, land trust, and foreshore tenure. Land acquisition means the purchase or expropriation of land by local government for the primary purpose of improving public safety concerns or reducing liability. acquisition is usually seen as a last resort, but it is an opportunity that has been used quite frequently, particularly in the United States, where over 20,000 properties have been acquired, facilitated by FEMA, putting up 75% of the money for land acquisition, particularly in river areas to allow for the flows to extend over a larger area and reduce the risk to other areas. But it also occurred in Alberta, where over 250 properties in the middle of a floodway were actually acquired because the government determined that, allowing future development to rebuild there was a bad investment. Transfer of development potential really is a voluntary market-based concept in which the development potential is transferred from a hazard area to an area not at risk. It's not used to any large extent. It's popular in the academic literature, but the concept is really taking area from a donor site to a receiving site. The donor site is moving the risk, transferring the risk into an area where that risk is not present, but it has very little application. Variations are rolling easements, where there's legislation in Texas, for example, that deals with that subject. So it has been some experiments in that area, but it's quite limited. Easements and covenants. It's a legal agreement in which one landowner grants the use of some real property rights to another for a specific purpose. There's quite a few legal elements here, but essentially the easement is an agreement between two private property owners. Statutory right-of-way is where government is a variation of an easement, and then the covenant is where a covenant is put on title, and the expression is runs with the land. So if a covenant to restrict the use of land to a particular purpose occurs, even though the property is subsequently sold, it would still stay on title. And that has a particular advantage of serving as notice to future property owners. You're deemed to be aware of that risk if it's on title, because anybody would naturally search the conditions of ownership if they're considering the purchase of property. One of the advantages of easements and statutory rights-of-way is that the acquisition cost to reduce the risk is typically much less than the full acquisition of the property. A variation here is the use of land trusts, really a non-profit private organization created for the purpose of environmental conservation or some other environmental purpose. It's been used to a very successful extent, and it really involves a covenant on the land to restrict the use of the land, and it has some advantages in that often the private sources of funds may be available, and you have private management, and if you have a strong land trust, that can work very successfully. Foreshore tenure is a legal instrument that authorizes the use or uses over intertidal and subtidal areas. The advantage here is to take the foreshore land between the high water mark and lands farther out and use that to dissipate the energy of incoming waves, and it has been used quite successfully in a number of jurisdictions. West Vancouver and in the Lower Mainland is one good example. It also has some environmental benefits. Structural tools, some of these are scour protection, structural elevation, dikes, other hard protection, and wet floodproofing. Scour protection really is a property-specific structural tool to protect building foundations or shoreline from being eroded or undermined due to the effects of moving water. Here's a case of avian cages protecting the foundations for a bridge. Structural elevation, raising the elevation of buildings, infrastructure, and land. Here's an example in Squamish where the ground elevation provides access to parking, but it is not habitable space. The habitable space is the next two levels. Another variation for single-family dwellings is also in Squamish, is a brand new development in which the areas from the stairs down is not habitable space. It can be a cellar. typically 1.5 meters or less, so you can't really stand up in it and use it for habitable purposes, but the lands above are the habitable space. So it uses that extra land to protect floodwaters. If they occur, they're not going to be destroying the dwelling. Dikes, linear structure, an embankment structure designed to protect a designated area from flooding. There's a case where this is a picture in Delta where the pertinent structures were raised to protect it from sea level along Boundary Bay on the right side of the picture. So that's the typical protect structure approach, and we're seeing examples of looking at elevating dikes, but that has consequences because a 1 meter elevation in a dike height does have significant linear implications. If you have a 5-to-1 slope at the toe going on the outward area into the ocean, that's to dissipate the energy. That's 5 meters for 1 meter, and plus, let's say, another 2 or 3 meters on the landward side. You're looking into significant land impacts. Groynes, an approach of dissipating incoming energy. Here's a case in English Bay in Vancouver. You can see them jutting out, typically 90 degrees to the land. Breakwater is a case basically using a structure to stop the incoming waves, dissipate that energy before it hits protected structures, in this case a harbor in Powell River. Bulkheads, more offshore approaches, dissipating the energy before it comes in. Seawall, here's an interesting picture of the Stanley Park Seawall in Vancouver, which was taken at a very strong storm event almost exactly a year ago. The challenge with seawalls is that the energy comes straight at the seawall, and it is all the seawall has to absorb all of that energy. It typically produces risks to the toe of the slope. You need deep excavations to protect that area from undermining, and you can see the waves shoot up very dramatically. I think here's another example of a seawall where it really transferred the risk from to two property owners in the 1% club. You can see extremely valuable properties, but one person erected a giant seawall going into the foreshore area, and it transferred the risk and essentially destroyed the foreshore environment for an adjacent property. So it's really important to have a proper engineering analysis here. Tidal barriers, very little application in North America, but it's something that is being looked at in other jurisdictions, in jurisdictions as a long-term solution to consider. And wet floodproofing, there's very little application in Canada, but it has been used, and essentially it's the use of flood-resistant materials, elevation of electrical and mechanical services, and the use of openings for drainage to eliminate structural uplift when floodwaters come into an area. So it has been used more in the United States, and for a low flood event, replacing with gyprock and low-lying electrical facilities is an option that might be very cost-effective. And then finally, we have non-structural tools, essentially looking at coastal wetland creation, dune building, and beach nourishment. Coastal wetland creation really is dissipating wave and tidal energy with vegetation and root systems that act as a trap for sediments, facilitating accretion and reducing erosion. It also has significant environmental benefits. So it stops it's really a buffer. Dune building is the use of wind-formed or artificial sand deposits representing a store of sediment in the zone landward of a normal high tide. Unfortunately, we've had a history of people building on dunes, particularly in the East Coast along the United States, and that's had some disastrous consequences. We have very few dunes in British Columbia, except on Graham Island and a few places in Haida Gwaii, and it's something that's much more common in Prince Edward Island and the East Coast. But the dunes are essentially a protective mechanism to serve as a buffer, and artificial dunes have been used with quite a bit of success in Eastern Canada. And finally, beach nourishment, really the addition of sand or other similar sediment material to satisfy the erosional forces of natural wave action and prevent shoreline erosion. So the beach nourishment, the sand, is a sacrificial element, but the cost of the sacrifice is you're not destroying buildings. You have an ongoing maintenance cost, but not affecting the structures. So that really covers all of our tools. And there's lots of variations. I wanted to show one. Living shorelines is a way of managing coastal areas that protect and restore, enhance, and create natural shoreline habitat. This is Dockside Green in the Victoria area, a Leeds Platinum project where they use natural measures to reduce the risk for erosion and undertaken environmentally, as well as a protective measure for the building. So there's lots of opportunities to use these in different accommodations, and this has been a very successful approach. It's originated in the United States and has had application in British Columbia, PEI, and New Brunswick. Flood insurance is an area we don't have, and I'll just mention as a possibility for inclusion in the future. And so as you can see, the adaptation framework can use these tools in different combinations, and they may change from time to time as we evaluate risk in a different way. In summary, sea level rise is a challenge for Canada's southern coast. Every community and context is different. We have a large toolkit of available tools. We need an adaptation strategy, and that has to be locally based. Primer is a starting point for considering adaptation options and approaches. Good news is we have time, but sea level rise is not going away.
Thank you so much, Graham. That's an amazing overview of the many tools available. Much appreciate that. So now it's up to folks on the phone. This is the time to ask questions to either speaker as you wish. Perhaps something has caught your fancy or you want a bit more information. And so you can direct your questions either to Thomas or Graham, but type them into your question box and I will read them out as they come in. So I'm just going to give people a couple minutes and hopefully people are able to see the question box there. Again, a reminder that this presentation will be available online. We're going to be putting it up onto the retooling.ca website, which I'll show at the very end in case people don't know it. And yes, to get the ball rolling, I think, Thomas, you've probably unmuted yourself again. And so I was just going to throw out a quick question. You know, what is kind of your top 1 or 2 tips for local governments starting to deal with sea level rise? You've given us lots to think about, but kind of top tips.
Well, I think I don't know if I have top tips. I would just re-emphasize what Graham said. 2 things that Graham said in closing. One, I think, is that the primer is a very rich resource for local governments that are thinking about what they can do. It really is a compendium of all the possible things that the local government or any planners, et cetera, might want to consider. And I think that primer adds to some of the things I skimmed over very quickly, but the mapping guidelines and the sea dike construction guidelines and the flood construction elevation guidelines. So my feeling is that we have have a lot of great tools to help think through this problem. And then I think two other points I would just emphasize are, I think again, the second point that Graham made at the end, that we have time, but not necessarily a lot of time. So we have time to think this through, and I think in particular time to manage the expense of implementation, but we do want to get started. We want to get started soon. And I think the third point I would make that both Graham and I emphasized is that these local circumstances and a local plan are what's going to work best. There is no one-size-fits-all solution that the province could suggest or impose in any way. A lot of the decision-making has to be made at a local level with the involvement of the public. So I think, again, we've got a rich set of tools that we can draw from to do that. And perhaps I'll just add again that one of the primer itself, there will be a new version released hopefully by the end of the calendar year, which is the sort of a full compendium of all of the tools that Graham has described. But Graham has also produced for us companion materials that are either in a poster format or PowerPoint slides or things that are intended to help with the public communication aspect of some of these issues. And those will be, we haven't quite figured out how to make those available, but the intention is for those to be available to local governments and others to assist with communication when they're going out for public engagement and they want to talk about what some of these options are. So I think I'll leave it at that and turn it back to you, Elizabeth, in case there are other questions.
Yeah, so we'll get, maybe, Graham, you might have one or two things to answer, but let's just go to this one other question and we'll come back if we have time. So this is for Thomas. The sea level rise curves were increasingly steep. So if we were planning for 2,200, what would be the level to consider in BAU? I'm not sure what that business as usual. So Thomas, did you get that?
Yes, I did. So the planning curve that we suggest is just a linear, it's a line, and the 2,200 on that curve is 2 meters. Which, if we went back to it, is up until about 2,100. Using a 1 meter standard is at the conservative end. With time, if the rate of sea level rise accelerates, then the 2,200, you keep projecting out a straight line, that becomes less and less conservative with time. I think our thinking has shifted a little bit, that we should pay less attention to by when we are going to reach a certain level of sea level rise, and actually just start planning for at least a meter, I would say, and probably between 1 and 2 meters. So the thermal inertia in the ocean, there's a dynamic in the climate system that is, for all intents and purposes, locked in, especially for sea level rise. So we're going to hit those levels on that curve at some point in the future, and as I said, our recent thinking has been: is it actually helpful to talk about, well, it'll be a meter by 2,100? There are some people who think that it's possible at the extreme end that we will see a meter of sea level rise before 2,100, and if not by 2,100, then certainly by 2120, etc. So I guess there's a conversation around to ask: is a curve that shows sea level rise over time even helpful? Should we not just lock in a number like a meter and say, for all intents and purposes, we should be planning for that? And I think then the question, it's a different question. So I'm not sure I've entirely answered it. I mean, other than to say, I think we want to be prudent according to the curve. 2 meters is the 2,200 standard, but really I think we should step back from all of that and understand that sea level rise is going to continue, and we need to manage those risks. And perhaps it's more helpful to think about a number and plan to that number rather than when it's going to happen.
Great, thanks. So one last question before we're finished here for Graham. Are there other tools more pertinent to agricultural adaptation, sometimes missed in municipal planning?
Agricultural adaptation. I guess most of our focus has been on more urban areas. It may be unfair, but the Agricultural Land Reserve has actually served as a very excellent planning tool to direct urban development away from some of these areas that are most at risk. The challenge with agriculture is salinization and as well as inundation, but there may be opportunities for agriculture to look at variations on what we've been doing historically, but still protect the land base. It's just that as we look at greater sea level rise, the benefit cost ratio on protecting agricultural lands is going to be increasingly challenging.
Great. So given that time's running out, I just want to thank the two speakers. It's been really very insightful. And what I wanted to do was just bring to highlight that the webinar, as well as other tools for local governments to adapt to climate change, are available on retooling.ca. We have some success stories there, a searchable database, and so take a look. I will also let you know when the webinar is actually available in case you have colleagues that may want to see it. Lastly, if you have further questions, feel free to email me at this address. And I'd just like to thank again Natural Resources Canada and the Climate Action Secretariat for supporting the delivery of these 3 webinars. We'll definitely let you know if there's future ones planned, but there's no specific dates currently posted. But thank you so much again for this insightful discussion, which is much needed given that sea level rise is definitely coming. Thanks so much. Have a good day.